Ezra Levant here from Rebel News. I'm in Lethbridge, Alberta, outside the Lethbridge Correctional Center. Inside is Chris Carbert, one of the so-called Coutts four men who were charged at the Coutts border blockade over 2 years ago. In Chris's case, he was charged with 3 other men with conspiracy to commit murder against a police officer. It was shocking news when the RCMP announced it, so shocking that the rest of the truckers basically packed it in. People didn't want to be associated with the threat of violent crime. In fact, one of the important characteristics of the trucker protest all across Canada, not only at the Coutts border blockade, but in Windsor, Ontario, and in Ottawa, was just how peaceful it all was. It was a protest of bouncy castles and hot tubs, and at the most, horn honking. That's why Canadians loved it. That's why Trudeau hated it. Trudeau wanted a January 6th insurrection narrative. The truckers simply refused to give it to him. The media tried, but with citizen journalists, including embedded in the blockade itself, for example, we had 2 rebel reporters there the whole time, Trudeau simply couldn't make that case. But then an astonishing set of charges were made, and shortly thereafter, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, putting the country under a form of martial law, something never used before, not even during 9/11. Some people immediately said, was this arrest and were these charges a pretext to launch the Emergencies Act? I think it was a fair question given how politicized police were during the lockdowns. But when information came out from police and prosecutors, it looked like it was very serious indeed. Rebel News was crowdfunding legal defenses for truckers charged with civil disobedience, and by that, I mean peaceful protests. You may know that Rebel News represents thousands of people across the country, or more precisely, Rebel News has crowdfunded for thousands of people. Some are represented by Rebel News. Many are represented through the Democracy Fund. Rebel News crowdfunds for Tamara Leach, the great trucker leader in Ottawa, for Arthur Pavlovsky, the Christian pastor in Alberta, who was actually prosecuted for giving a sermon to the truckers. But Rebel News made the decision not to provide crowdfunding for the 4 Coutts men because the nature of the charges against them were not civil liberties charges. They were charges of most grave crimes. Rebel News did pay for the bail hearing at their first instance, sending 4 lawyers, but after that, it simply was, in my personal view, outside the scope of the donor intentions. Donors wanted peaceful protest, but having a conspiracy to commit murder obviously exceeded that. But as the months turned into years, questions arose. Did these men actually do what they were accused of doing? But then a couple of weeks ago, something absolutely surprising happened. At least it was surprising to me. 2 of the Coutts 4, frankly, the 2 that I thought the police had the strongest case against, signed a plea bargain, made a deal to walk out of jail immediately for time served. And these were men who were charged with the others with conspiracy to commit murder, but they pled guilty to very minor weapons charges, the kind of thing that if they happened to you as a hunter or a farmer, would at most have your firearms license suspended for a number of years, at most a suspended sentence, no jail time. If these were the men who've been kept in prison for 2 full years, and all the Crown prosecution wanted from them is an admission that they, in one case, had an unauthorized loaded weapon, and in another case, a man agreed to bring a gun to the blockade, which was a bad idea, of course. But that's far from a conspiracy to commit murder. If the 2 men that I perceive to have the weakest case in this prosecution would get such an easy plea, what about the other 2? And so today I visited Chris Carbert in the Lethbridge Correctional Center. I spoke at length with the family. We talked about some of the evidence. We talked about what it's like in prison. And I said to Chris that while I made the decision 2 years ago with the facts in front of me, and while I think that decision based on those facts was correct at the time, I no longer feel that way. I'm not in a position to say whether or not Chris Carbert is innocent or guilty. That's not my job. That's a job for the courts. But it is crystal clear to me that the police overcharged him, that the prosecutors have exaggerated what these men have done, and that the evidence may not be what the police claimed it was in that ITO information to obtain when they first brought it to the court. And if that is the case, the fact that Chris Carbert and Tony Olenek are still in jail 2 years later is actually a political punishment for being embarrassers of Justin Trudeau. And the sense that many people had 2 years ago that these were trumped up political charges to pave the way for the Emergencies Act may well be true. These men could still be found guilty of the severe crimes mentioned before, but I don't think that's likely anymore. And so while these charges still exceed what Rebel News and certainly the Democracy Fund would normally crowdfund for, after talking to the family, I have decided to set up a special crowdfunding account just for Chris Carbert at helpchris.ca. And in talking to Chris and the family, we've decided to proceed this way. All funds at helpchris.ca will go to pay for his lawyers to help run the trial or do other legal work in the weeks and months ahead. Not to pay past legal bills, but to pay legal bills in the future. The crowdfunding at helpchris.ca will be public and transparent for everyone to see, the family and the public. Should there be a surplus in the fund at the end of the trial, Chris and the family and I agree that the funds should go to other trucker litigation, including that funded by the Democracy Fund. As I mentioned before, Rebel News and or the Democracy Fund have represented 55 truckers in Alberta alone, as well as Windsor and Ottawa, including Tamara Leach. Some people will not want to contribute to this because they may believe that the police and the prosecutors have something here, that these men did commit a crime, or at least we should wait until we find out what the judge has to say. And I respect that, and that's why I am not using funds that were granted just for civil liberties purposes in this matter. This is a completely new crowd fund that will be held separate and apart. But the fact that two men were let go in the manner that they were suggests to me that the Crown does not have the case that they claimed they did. I'll tell you one more thing I learned today when I talked to Chris. He was not allowed certain disclosure until 2 years. In fact, just very recently. In fact, some disclosure from the Crown he has not received yet. Disclosure, by the way, are details on all the evidence, including exculpatory evidence that could prove his innocence. One of those, said Chris, was a message that he texted to people saying, come to Coutts for a peaceful protest. And this was hidden from him and his lawyers in the disclosure package until very recently. Why would police do that? Why would police overcharge? Why would they attempt to try the case in the court of public opinion? Was it to help Justin Trudeau proceed with the invocation of the Emergencies Act? Why would they decline to disclose, as is their constitutional obligation? And why was the case so serious when it was announced, dropped so lightly against Chris Lysak and Jerry Moran, who were let go with modest firearms offenses? Given the facts that I know now, I can no longer say that this is not a civil liberties case. I believe it is. I don't know Chris Carbert well, nor do I know the family well. And any prisoner has hardships. Chris has told me that during his time in prison, his father passed away and his brother passed away. I'm sure the stress of having Chris in jail made both of their situations worse. He told me about his children who were growing up without their dad. These are heartbreaking things to hear. And I'm sure every prisoner, whether they're charged with a civil liberties offense or whether they're charged with a horrendous crime, has the same personal hardship. But in this case, I am increasingly of the view that he is a political prisoner. I told him that we're going to help. And we're going to help in the special way I've described. And if you believe that we should help Chris Harbert, whereas we didn't in the past, if you, like me, think we should, then please join me. I've made the first donation of $500 at helpchris.ca. And together, hopefully we can get him legal representation that will help us get to the truth. And if the truth is as I suspect it is, to his acquittal and release. Go to helpchris.ca.